What really exploded behind those palace doors that morning was anything but ordinary. Not even remotely. Before sunrise, the corridors weren't merely quiet. They felt locked down, as though the palace itself refused to breathe. Phones vanished, conversations ended abruptly, staff quietly rerouted without a single explanation. And buried inside that eerie silence, a decision was taking shape that wouldn't remain hidden much longer. It began as what insiders labeled an estate discussion. But anyone who understands how real power operates recognized something far bigger. Estate discussions rarely redraw emotional lines within a family. They rarely determine which children become tomorrow's priority, while another branch quietly slips into the background. Yet that was precisely what unfolded. Because when the so-called Sussex financial structure faced review, it wasn't treated like ordinary paperwork. It was handled like a ticking liability, a danger, a breaking point. And once language like that enters a room, emotions instantly step aside. Everything becomes deliberate inside those walls. Charles wasn't acting like a man signing paperwork. He looked like someone measuring consequences that had quietly accumulated for years. The file wasn't simply read. It was examined as though every page carried the weight of history. Every pause felt significant. Every silence seemed to reach its conclusion before he uttered a single word. Then came the twist almost nobody anticipated. What had once been presented as a bridge connecting two sides of the family was no longer viewed as unity. It was suddenly treated as vulnerability. Something that could no longer remain untouched. And that was the moment everything shifted, because the redirection wasn't merely financial on paper. It carried emotional consequences nobody inside that room could honestly ignore. The beneficiaries being identified weren't strangers. They were the next generation already living beneath impossible expectations: George, Charlotte, and Louis, names that abruptly stopped sounding like children and started representing institutional direction. William didn't celebrate. That's the part nobody saw coming. There wasn't triumph in his posture, nor relief across his face. Instead, something far heavier settled over him. The kind of silence that arrives when understanding replaces instinctive reaction. He understood exactly what was being protected, and exactly what was being pushed even farther away throughout the process. Because the real conflict was never about money, it was about the message hidden beneath it. And that message echoed so loudly even silence couldn't bury it. Meanwhile, Charles remained focused on the clause that made everything legally possible. Future safeguarding, a phrase that appeared harmless on paper, almost administrative. Yet inside that room, it didn't resemble policy. It felt like a verdict postponed for years that had finally found permission to speak. Future safeguarding meant one thing in reality. Whatever happened next had to be shielded from whatever came before. And once that thinking enters a royal system, reconciliation stops being hope and starts becoming risk. That's when the witnesses became impossible to ignore. Camilla was present. William was present. A senior advisor was present. Suddenly this wasn't merely a private adjustment anymore. It became a documented moment that could never completely return to secrecy. Because once names become attached to decisions like these, the decision no longer belongs to intention and starts belonging to history. Behind every shocking decision, one truth refused to disappear: Harry wasn't inside that room. Yet somehow he remained at the center of everything, because the instant that clause took effect, the emotional direction of the entire family changed. What once resembled a bridge suddenly felt like a separation already completed, needing only an official announcement. And the most unsettling part, nobody spoke it aloud. Everything unfolded through language calm enough to dismiss panic, yet precise enough to eliminate any chance of reversal. Camilla noticed first that certain names had quietly stopped being repeated. She sensed the atmosphere shift the moment Harry was no longer mentioned within the same structural framework. It wasn't about what people said. It was about what they suddenly stopped saying. That's where the deeper fracture truly began. because long before signatures, clauses, or estate terminology, there had already been a dinner. A private April conversation everyone still remembered differently depending on whom you asked. Harry demanding protection without internal control. William refusing to separate responsibility from structure. Charles watching both sons speak identical words while describing completely different realities. And during that moment, something inside the family stopped moving forward together. It quietly split forever without any formal announcement. The settlement dinner, as insiders later called it, never ended with resolution. It ended with silence so overwhelming it felt like a door had closed without anyone even touching it. After that evening, nothing surrounding the estate discussions remained neutral again. Everything became either repair or protection. And in the end, protection won. The real collapse in tone never happened inside the palace press room or through an official statement. It arrived later in fragments when the private communication finally reached Harry. Not through spectacle, not through media chaos, but through a carefully controlled message delivered with surgical precision. The kind of message crafted not to trigger outrage, but to eliminate negotiation. Even so, it landed with crushing force because what Harry heard wasn't merely that the trust arrangement had changed. What he immediately understood reached somewhere much deeper. The family's structure of expectation had been rewritten without him ever entering the room. The wording remained careful, almost courteous, but underneath it rested something colder, finality, and at that instant the emotional weight shifted completely. Harry didn't explode publicly at first. There was no instant statement, no dramatic escalation, only silence. The kind that reveals a mind struggling to accept something, refusing to feel temporary, because money inside this family had never represented only money. It represented alignment. It represented positioning. It represented closeness to the center. And suddenly that closeness felt diminished. Meghan, standing beside him while the message arrived, understood everything faster than anyone else. She didn't require explanations. She recognized the structure immediately. This wasn't a financial adjustment standing alone. It was a symbolic repositioning, a statement revealing where every branch now stood in relation to the future. And she expressed what the silence inside that room refused to admit: this would not stay private for long. Not because someone intentionally leaked it, but because decisions like these always find their way into public interpretation. And once that happens, meaning stops being controlled. Harry, however, wasn't focused on public interpretation yet. He remained trapped inside the private timeline. The April dinner. William's tone of voice. The instant Charles set his glass down instead of answering immediately. Every detail replayed not simply as memory but as unmistakable pattern, as though every step had always been leading directly toward this moment. What happened next between the brothers wasn't the emotional breakthrough everyone expected. It was something far colder. When William finally spoke to Harry directly without aids, without filters, the conversation offered no comfort. Instead, it exposed positions neither brother truly wanted to accept. William described it as protecting the next generation, not excluding anyone. But Harry heard something entirely different beneath those carefully chosen words. Not protection, but replacement. A future being designed where his branch no longer occupied the center of continuity planning. And that single word, continuity, carried more weight than anything else. Because inside a monarchy, continuity isn't emotional language. It's structural language. It determines who is built into tomorrow and who is quietly expected to exist beyond its boundaries. William never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His restraint only widened the emotional distance between them. Harry, on the opposite end of the call, didn't hold back. Every sentence carried years of accumulated frustration. Every pause overflowed with interpretations of distance, loyalty, and belonging. Yet the most important detail wasn't what they argued. It was what remained unresolved. Because neither brother possessed the power to reverse the decision. The clause had already taken effect. The signatures already existed. The structure had already transformed from possibility into official record. And within that reality, even disagreement felt completely powerless. Charles, standing quietly behind it all, wasn't portrayed as victorious. That was what made everything even more complicated. He wasn't behaving like a strategist proudly closing another file. He looked like someone carrying the unbearable weight of something irreversible. Every administrative phrase, future safeguarding, estate instruction, restricted archive, came wrapped in emotional consequences he could never completely escape. Camilla noticed it more clearly than anyone. Not his authority, but his exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from making difficult decisions, but from realizing every decision quietly erases another version of the future. Because once the Sussex file entered restricted handling, something subtle shifted throughout the palace. It stopped functioning as an active bridge. It became history under careful management. And history, once managed, rarely leaves room for reconciliation. Outside those palace walls, the transition from private decision to public narrative happened faster than anyone inside anticipated. Headlines refused to wait for nuance. They reduced everything to direction. Who gained? Who lost? Who remained central? Who was quietly pushed aside? Inside that simplification, every layer of emotional complexity disappeared. All that remained was interpretation. William viewed the public reaction not as validation, but as distortion. He understood how quickly intention transforms into narrative once it escapes private control. Catherine focused somewhere entirely different, on the children, because the moment their names entered the public conversation, innocence stopped protecting them automatically. It became something requiring protection from meaning itself. Charles remained silent much longer than anyone expected. Not because he lacked something to say, but because speaking too soon risked turning explanation into justification. And justification, under circumstances like these, would only deepen the fracture. So the silence remained. Yet silence inside a monarchy is never truly empty. It accumulates. Harry experienced that accumulation differently. Not as policy, but as distance that could no longer be mistaken for temporary strain. The emotional translation of the decision became painfully simple, even if the structure behind it remained complicated. The center had shifted, and he was no longer standing within it. Once that realization settles into someone's mind, it never asks permission to remain. It simply stays. Ultimately, the trust redirection never functioned like one isolated event. It unfolded as a sequence: dinner, disagreement, clause, signature, communication, interpretation, exposure. Every step reinforced the previous one until the outcome no longer felt shocking, only inevitable when viewed in hindsight. Even then, the hardest truth was never really about money, structure, or protocol. It was about permanence. Because inside a family built upon legacy, being repositioned never feels like a simple adjustment. It feels like being rewritten into the future itself. And that is exactly where the silence still remains, unfinished, unresolved, and nowhere near its ending.